at this time. Amazing things have happened here 150 years ago. And the best part of it is that you've put your lives on hold. You've braved the heat and the humidity to be here to affirm what they did here 150 years ago. History's still relevant, and you've made it relevant. You're part of that continuum of history, and I thank you all for that. Charles C. Brown, a soldier in Charles Griffin's Union Brigade, remembered being right here. The grape and canister, as they left on their messages of destruction, seemed to be living demons who shrieked and yelled with delight as they hurled themselves against the body of the rebels. He wrote immediately after this battle, "Those who were there witnessed a scene awful, grand, terrific, and sublime, yet infernal in its character. 150 years ago, right now, the fields and woods around you would have been engulfed in lurid flame and the sublime smoke of battle. The noise around you would have been deafening and unnerving. The cries of mutilated men and dying animals would have been heartrending. And the smell of summer sweat, grimy soldiers, human gore, and pooling blood would have been offensive in the extreme. Fear was palpable here at Malvern Hill, and it permeated the very air. And so was determination. This spot, where you are tonight, a century and a half ago, marked the first time that the armies that we know as the Union Army of the Potomac and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia met and were arrayed in the full presence, strength, and majesty of their respective commands. Now, there have been bloodier battles prior to this. There was Gaines' Mill. But these transpired between elements of these forces. But here, these armies marshaled in the full manifestation, the full realization of their own numbers and that of their opponents. Men fought and died right here in the climactic ending of the 7 days battles around Richmond, the culmination of the largest military operation ever executed in North America. And it became the capstone event to men's zeal and ideals, and also to pain and human suffering and endurance. This is where Robert E. Lee lost a battle and won a campaign and won lasting fame, and perhaps for a moment won a nation. And this is where General George B. McClellan won a battle and lost an army and lost his reputation and lost an old way of life. Each would claim victory here at Malvern Hill, and each in their own way did win. And each in their own way also suffered defeat as well. And both of them left uncertain what to do with it. The Peninsula Campaign marked the dramatic end of one chapter in the American Civil War. And it also marked the beginning of a new chapter with a new war and a new type of war. And Malvern Hill particularly would resonate in the memories of Northerners and Southerners with a profound effect on both of them. The 7 days witnessed the rise of Robert E. Lee, but it also marked the corresponding decline of George B. McClellan. Now, McClellan's campaign marked the first real, genuine threat to the national sovereignty of the Southern Confederacy. The Confederates had fought and lost other battles and campaigns before now, at places out west, like Fort Henry's and Donelson, like Shiloh, all of which impinged and impaired the Confederacy and deprived it of valuable real estate, valuable resources, and valuable manpower. But McClellan's maneuvers, his calculations, had put him squarely on the virtual doorstep of Richmond and the very seat of Confederate government and power. Other Northern armies elsewhere could hurt and hinder the Confederacy, but only this army here, the Army of the Potomac alone, could literally have destroyed the Confederacy in 1862. Robert E. Lee marshaled an impressive array of troops and commanders for the defense of Richmond. He cobbled a command that the 7 days would test and steel and galvanize into one of the elite fighting forces of American military history, if not world military history. The Army of Northern Virginia was born in the crucible of the 7 days battle, just as the Army of the Potomac was set and solidified on the Virginia Peninsula. For Lee here, some did well, and some did not. After Malvern Hill, some would flourish, and some would fail. Those who would not or could not meet Lee's bold demand for audacity would leave. Of the original 6 major generals who were with Lee here at Malvern Hill, 3 would be assigned elsewhere in the immediate aftermath of Malvern Hill. Of the remaining 3, 2 would never see the end of the war, and the 3rd would be crippled for life from a wound at the Wilderness. McClellan, his conservative caution deprived him of a real opportunity to turn the tables on Robert E. Lee and his all too aggressive Confederate Army. The Battle of Malvern Hill should have never happened, but it did, and the Confederates lost heavily. 5,650 men out of approximately 20,300 participants. 5,650 men out of 20,000 participants fell on this battlefield. The Confederates lost 28% of their attacking force here at Malvern Hill. Correspondingly, over the course of the entire 7 days battle, Malvern Hill amounted to 28% of all the Confederate losses. And those 28%, those 5,650 men, fell on this one day, on this one battlefield. D.H. Hill said this was not war, it was murder. We've heard that often. All the historians have used it, and used it well. They're right. The Union Army did not go unscathed for fighting here. It lost approximately 15,855 soldiers in the course of the 7 days, and almost 20% of those losses occurred here at Malvern Hill. That is to say, 3,000 Union soldiers, 3,007 Union soldiers fell here at Malvern Hill. They fell on these fields, on this hill, and in those woods. Now, the Union soldiers, and the Union officers particularly, plainly understood the inequitable damage that was inflicted at Malvern Hill, and believed a counterattack on July 2nd would start them once and for all earnestly on the road to Richmond and to the end of the rebellion. Instead, McClellan ordered the Army of the Potomac to retreat in the dead of night under the cover of a terrific downpour of rain. McClellan was retreating from victory to take a defensive position at Harrison's Landing on the James River. One federal commander, General Philip Kearny, seethed at this decision and said that it was nothing short of treason. Things would change in the Army of the Potomac. Things had to change in the Army of the Potomac. In 1 year, following Malvern Hill, of all of McClellan's corps commanders, not one of them would still be with the Army. Of the 11 divisions of the Union Army at Malvern Hill, only 3 division commanders would still be with this Army in 1 year's time at Gettysburg. And those 3 would be gone in less than 2 years' time from this moment. Interesting little aside, if you're trying to figure out who the 3 are, They're the only division commanders in the Union Army with their surnames beginning with the letter S. For whatever reason, if your name began with S, you were safe for at least 1 year. McClellan's retreat from victory left the Confederates masters of the field. This raised our drooping spirits to the point of enthusiasm, recalled a Virginian in William Mahone's brigade, as it left us the victors. These victors by concession, these victors by default, had ensured the safety and security of the capital at Richmond for an extended period of time. Malvern Hill, in one sense, did mark the end of the rebellion and the beginning of something new, something vastly larger, and something more significant than a rebellion. It marked a revolution. A revolution. Up to this time, the Southern Confederacy had struggled to maintain itself and to establish its identity. Regardless of sentimentality, Southerners at the time simply did not know whether the Confederacy could endure or even hope to survive. Lee's ability to thwart the direct challenge to the capital not only protected and enhanced Southern sovereignty at home and abroad, but it sparked confidence and it generated widespread commitment to the Southern cause. People believed in the Southern Confederacy after Malvern Hill and the 7 Days. The Confederacy was a firm reality now in 1862 and demonstrably secure in its ability to defend itself, at least for the next 3 years. Now, President Abraham Lincoln recognized that the Civil War had changed fundamentally following the Battle of Malvern Hill. Initially, his armies had set out in 1861 to put down an insurrection, a conflict directed against a small minority faction that had somehow seized the reins of power in the South. On the peninsula, Lincoln conceded that the Confederates were much better organized than he initially thought, and he prepared to put down a rebellion, a struggle between warring ideologues and their armies. And after the debacle of the 7 Days, Abraham Lincoln realized how Southern victory had legitimized and strengthened the Confederacy in the eyes of those both at home, and I should mention North and South, and those abroad watching this conflict. The groundswell of Southerners' support for the war effort made it evident that this was no longer a rebellion, but a full-blown revolution, a contest not between armies and leaders, but something far more pervasive, between peoples and cultures. The war had escalated to an all-or-nothing proposition that ultimately propelled the Northern president to make radical leaps to revolutionize his own war aims and his own war effort to meet these fundamental shifts in the overall conflict. No longer content to deal with a rebellion, but to deal with a culture. He attacked anything and everything that kept the Union Army at bay, that kept the Confederate Army in the field, that sustained and supported the war effort, and that included slavery. Lincoln would alter his goals after Malvern Hill. He would no longer be working to restore the Union, but he would focus on creating a new nation worthy of fighting for. The legacy of this surprise Union retreat from victory and this surprise Confederate victory by conceding the field were ultimately the consolidation and perseverance of the Southern Confederacy, the distinct likelihood of European intervention or mediation in American affairs, and also the emancipation of millions of bondsmen. The most compelling legacy of Malvern Hill, however, was the commitment of both sides to endure another relentless 3 years of profound grinding loss, of damage, destruction, suffering, and bloodshed. In 1864 alone, the Union Army would lose 65,000 men just to get this close to Richmond, and no closer. Many thousands would die because of the decisions that were made here in 1862. The Confederates were disturbed, and perhaps we can make the case literally haunted, by their victory at Malvern Hill. Almost precisely a year to the day after Malvern Hill, Union and Confederate soldiers met on the killing fields of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. July 3rd, 1863, Pickett's charge. Union soldiers likened the coming slaughter to the abattoir of Fredericksburg, even chanting the name, Fredericksburg, 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 over and over again at the oncoming Confederates. But Southerners, however, didn't see the similarity. They hearkened back to a darker moment in their past, a darker moment in their memory. Captain Joseph Graham of the Charlottesville Artillery wrote of Gettysburg, "I feared then that I could see a want of resolution in our men, and I heard many say, 'This will be worse than Malvern Hill,' and I don't hardly see that position can be carried," and so forth. Enough to make me apprehensive of the result. Lieutenant James F. Crocker, whose 9th Virginia Infantry stormed this very hill repeatedly on July 1st, 1862, noted a discussion he had with Brigadier General Lewis A. Armistead at Gettysburg, in which the general told me it was, quote, to be another Malvern Hill, another costly day for Virginia and Virginians. It's interesting to note that their fear and their apprehension did not come from the bloodiest day of the war at Sharpsburg or Antietam, nor from Fredericksburg or Chancellorsville or Second Manassas or even Cedar Mountain, but from this deceptively pastoral setting, this bucolic little hill, where the war fundamentally changed its aims and its execution, and changed forever in its manner and its intensity. How often do the victors rue the victory? Malvern Hill is one of those puzzling touchstones in the journey through war, which closed the book on restoring the Union, closed the book on restoring the status quo antebellum, and closed the book on an old way of life. And it brought us to the fateful decision to forge a whole new republic in the aftermath of this bloodletting. The world would be a different place after Malvern Hill and July 1st, 1862. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to be hard-pressed to match Frank's eloquence. The only thing I have going for me is that when Frank and I divided up our duties this evening, I got the good assignment, or the better assignment, I guess, in which I can talk extensively about what happened in front of you 150 years ago this evening, tell you some stories about the battlefield. At the end of this long weekend, as we're all tired and steamy here, I'm not sure exactly whether what I say will resonate. Just before the talk, I saw so many people out in the audience beaming, a bunch of our staff smiling, and I pointed it out to the superintendent, and he said it was the smile of heat-induced insanity. He was referring to our staff, not to you. But nonetheless, I think there's a real possibility that whatever I say you won't remember anyway. But I'll do my best to instill a sense of place and time and sesquicentennial fervor as we stand here on the crest of Malvern Hill on the 150th anniversary of the battle. Give you a very little short setup. The previous week of the 7 days, we've done a pretty good job, I think, at Beaver Dam Creek and Gaines's Mill, and yesterday at Glendale Fraser's Farm Battlefield, of running some real-time tours, being out on the ground in the sizzling heat, following the soldiers at the key spots. Tonight at Malvern Hill, instead of making the forced march up the hill, we are convened here at the crest at just about the right time. There was fighting all during the afternoon 150 years ago. You learned earlier, those of you who were here, learned about the artillery barrage, the complicated crossfire that the Confederates endeavored to deliver to the crest of the hill unsuccessfully. And there were a few smaller previous infantry attacks, but the main fighting actually began. The primary Confederate assaults up the hill directly towards you as you're sitting here this evening began somewhere between, I think, 5:30 and 6 o'clock. But you have to remember that there was no daylight savings time, so that would put them between 6:30 and 7 o'clock our time. Fitzjohn Porter, the site commander up here on the crest of the hill, wrote later of the ominous silence that preceded the big main Confederate effort. And he timed the attack as beginning at about 6 o'clock. General Morrell, who commanded the Union troops on this side of Route 156, again, right where we're gathered now, he said the attack began at about 5:30. So either way, if it began at 5:30 or 6, that puts us right into the heart of the main Confederate attacks 150 years ago. At this moment, you all have the best view in the United States right at this precise moment. Nowhere else we should be other than here. There followed, after Magruder issued his attack instructions, 2.5 hours of carnage. And people who are not interested in battlefields, the non-believers and the unconverted, often remark, I've heard them say it many times, they say, well, every battlefield is the same. You've been to one, you've been to all. Don't know if they feel that way about automobiles, if they're happy driving a Prius instead of a Lexus. If they only go to one golf course, if every golf course is the same to them, they just play the same golf course over and over. People who say things like that don't understand battlefields. They have no idea what they're talking about. They fail to recognize, among other things, the immense human drama that unfolded on these places. Different in every case, on every battlefield, large and small, the tremendous impact on families and people and soldiers and ways of life across the disunited states between 1861 and 1865. So whether or not you believe that Malvern Hill affected the course of the Civil War or not, it surely affected the lives of the 8,000 people that Frank mentioned in the casualty figures who were shot here, either killed, maimed, or slightly wounded. Few of us have ever had a day in our lives as important as this was to them. Few of us have ever risked our own lives in any comparable way. Few of us have ever had our character and our resolve tested like the men did here at Malvern Hill and on other battlefields. Few of us have ever been in a situation where the stakes are the highest humanly possible, as they are on battlefields. The soldiers who were here and elsewhere often struggled to explain what they had seen and felt. And guys like me and Frank and other historians spent a lot of time collecting source material from people who were on the battlefields and trying to sift through that and understand a little bit better what those eyewitnesses endured. But I'll give you a couple of examples that are germane to right here at Malvern Hill. This from a Mississippian named Davis. Don't think he was connected to Jefferson Davis, but you never know, he might have been a cousin. He described the Federal artillery that plastered the Confederate approach areas a mile to your north. He told his family, he said, this was the most terrific and deafening roar I ever heard. In all descriptions of modern battles, the roar of cannon is dwelt upon. Here, there was nothing approaching a roar. It was one loud, incessant crash without intermission. It seemed as if the very elements themselves were wreaking their vengeance on us. You may think I exaggerate on this subject, but no. Language fails me to describe this scene as it really existed. He tried and felt inadequate to describe what he had seen on Malvern Hill. And a North Carolina soldier who attacked right towards you across these fields, a member of Garland's brigade of D.H. Hill's division, writing well after the war, trying to put this into perspective, he said, the enemy opened the most terrific and destructive fire in the face of my regiment that ever any troops met since the world began. He just wanted to make sure that his readers understood how bad it was since the world began. Now, he probably did not intend to be taken literally, but how else could he try to use words to tell us, his modern readers, what it was like on Malvern Hill? Those men survived unscathed, the two that I just quoted from. Another 8,000 men did not. And among those casualties were an untold number of men who fell to friendly fire. I have never been on a battlefield or studied a battlefield from the Civil War where there were more cases of men killed and wounded by friendly rounds. It's an inevitable consequence of any Civil War battlefield. Every large battlefield had friendly fire. Malvern Hill seemed to have more. Not quite sure why, but definitely the case. And that terrible fate applied to men in both armies. Consider this one example to illustrate my point. It's a moving letter written right after Malvern Hill by a man in the 10th Massachusetts, writing to the mother of his comrade. His comrade was named Haskell Hemingway of the 10th Massachusetts. And imagine having to write this letter. He said to Haskell Hemingway's mother, he said, our artillery were firing from the rear, and their shots consequently went directly over our heads. And they fired very low. It was from a discharge of canister from one of our own batteries that your son, while doing his duty bravely by loading and firing, was killed. He scarcely breathed after being struck. Bad enough to get a letter like that at home as a mother. Even worse to realize that your son was shot in the head by friendly artillery. That episode occurred directly in front of the West House. Those of you who were on the 5:30 walking tour and you gathered there and looked out across those fields, you saw where Haskell Hemingway was killed by friendly fire. And that's just one of many, many similar accounts from both armies. And men who saw that or accidentally perpetrated that, they were scarred in a way as well, even if they were not casualties of the battle. One man who was scarred here but survived and turned it into a positive thing was Henry Barnum, the major of the 12th New York Infantry. Barnum was shot in the stomach in the ravine directly below the crew house. That means right there, 100 yards to your left front, down in that swale at the bottom of the hill. Terrible shot. Thought he was mortally wounded. He survived with a grisly intestinal wound, managed to avoid infection, and lived a long and happy life. But while he was convalescing in New York, went home after Malvern Hill, he conceived a son whom he named Malvern Hill Barnum, and thus taking the worst day of his life and converting it into something that he would intentionally remember and appreciate, the joyous birth of his son. His son, by the way, Malvern Hill Barnum, became a decorated U.S. Army officer and was wounded in 1898 storming up San Juan Hill in Cuba. Malvern Hill Barnum. Terrain, of course, also makes battlefields unique. I don't need to preach to you all about this. You all are not the non-believers. You are the choir. But nonetheless, the visible swale immediately north of the cannon line, can't quite see it from here as we sit at this location, but the swale that gets so much attention, the only wrinkle in the ground for Confederate attackers, that swale, feeble though it was a prized location. And the best account I've ever seen from someone who was in that swale also is dramatic and moving, makes it an extra good account. This is from a Georgia captain in Robert Toombs's brigade, and he said when they reached that swale, we lay flat on the ground about an hour, I suppose. And he had a peculiar and somewhat sad experience. He said, where I lay, the grass was about 6 inches high. I saw a partridge close to my hand, hid in a bunch of grass, so frightened that it allowed me to take it up, though it had not been injured. I put it in my pocket, where it lay quietly until we went off the field and was turned loose again and joyfully flew away. What a telling example this was of the terrors of battle. And another terrain story, consider this one, lovingly told by Zebulon Vance, who became the wartime governor of North Carolina. But on July the 1st of 1862, Zeb Vance led a North Carolina regiment up the Crew House Slope, the 26th North Carolina. And terrain, very important even on that end of the field, but he seems to have embellished this story a little bit. Just telling the story after the war, he said that the men, the Confederates, repulsed under a terrific rain of shot and shell, lay down in a field of plowed ground between the rows for protection. But unfortunately, the furrows ran up toward the enemy batteries and served as troughs for the projectiles. And one fellow said, "Colonel, them cussed Virginians have plowed this field the wrong way." And in fact, that story is either entirely false or grossly exaggerated. There were no furrows down that side of the hill, and it didn't matter. But the fact that he was making mileage on the dinner circuit after the Civil War telling this story to an appreciative audience, he wouldn't have been telling it about some place where terrain was not so critical. Confederates who had been at Malvern Hill would appreciate something like that, where you could make fun of which way the furrows were plowed, more evidence about Malvern Hill's long-term effect on the memories of Confederate soldiers. And my very favorite story about Malvern Hill, one that you all will not have heard before. It is not a substantial story, I'm sorry to say, but it's a comical story. You have to have a little bit of comic relief. Even on a battlefield, the soldiers cherished those kinds of stories to help them get through the war. And this pertains to Hal Cobb, who was a Confederate politician and general. He was a fire eater before the war, and he put his body where his mouth had been. Instead of bringing on the war and then retiring, he led a brigade which charged straight up the slope of Malvern Hill. But Hal Cobb was not the greatest soldier, and he also weighed nearly 300 pounds. He would have struggled on a day like this, and the angle of his brigade's attack took them along the side slope. Some of his brigade in the flat field, some of them down the slope on what is today woods. And according to an eyewitness in his command, quote, General Hal Cobb, a large and portly man, dismounted to lead his brigade in person. General Cobb's spirit was willing, but his flesh was unmanageable. For catching his foot in the vines that were plentiful in the field, he fell and rolled over and over. And as there was no time to wait then for generals or anybody else, we kept on. And before he could disentangle himself and overtake us, the day was done. And I can assure you I will never walk the Confederate assault again without thinking about Hal Cobb rolling end over end down the slope with his ankle caught in the vines, the grapevines along the edge of Malvern Hill. And a few more anecdotes. I'm a big believer in forging connections between the battlefields and other things that are meaningful or interesting to us. The more you know about the battlefields, the more you want to know, and the more you know about the battlefields, the more interesting they are if you can nurture that interest. So consider these 4 or 5 connections between Malvern Hill and other things. Number 1, everybody here has heard of John C. Pemberton, famous Confederate general who surrendered Vicksburg in 1863 and earned the calumny of Confederate press and soldiers all across the South. Everyone accused him of being disloyal because he was a Pennsylvanian. And you can't have a Pennsylvanian commanding a Confederate army and expect anything but defeat, they said. Well, it's true, he was a Pennsylvanian, but what many people don't know is that General Pemberton's little brother, Andrew, who was 16 or 17 years younger, was in the Army of the Potomac, and he was present here at Malvern Hill. He was a lieutenant in the 23rd Pennsylvania Infantry, and he was shot right in front of the West House. General John C. Pemberton's little brother. He was not fatally killed, he was just wounded. But that proves the point about Pemberton's connections to the United States Army. His younger brother shot on the slope in front of the West House 150 years ago this afternoon. Many of you I know have either read the famous Civil War novel Cold Mountain or watched the movie. I'm glad to say I didn't do either one of them by choice, but I know how influential that book and movie were. And many of you know that the author, Charles Frazier, based that novel on a real relative of his, a North Carolina soldier who did serve in the Army of Northern Virginia. And his relative, William P. Inman, was in the 25th North Carolina and was wounded right there, attacking up the slope toward the crew house. And so that novel was based on the experiences of a real person who actually was a chronic deserter, like the man in the Cold Mountain movie. And you often wonder if his experiences at Malvern Hill perhaps eroded his southern partisanship. Maybe that turned him into a deserter, having to attack up Malvern Hill. There was a sergeant in the 16th Georgia, also of Hal Cobb's brigade. I don't know if he saw Hal Cobb roll down the hill or not, but his name was Oliver Hardy. And he probably was present here, not 100% certain. And precisely 30 years later, in 1892, he fathered a son, also named named Norvell Hardy, actually, who changed his name to Oliver Hardy when he went to Hollywood. He was the fat one in the Laurel and Hardy team, which were so famous and influential in the 20th century. So Oliver Hardy's father probably attacked across the slopes of Malvern Hill 150 years ago this evening. An entirely different sort of Georgian, not a Hollywood Georgian, but Doc Holliday. You all know Doc Holliday, one of America's greatest gunfighters. Doc Holliday was not here. He was 10 years old. He was not present. His father was in the Confederate Army, but was sick and was not present. But his uncle, his mother's brother, was in the 13th Georgia Infantry at Malvern Hill and was knocked out of the war with a desperate wound just in front of the parsonage, nearly a mile from where we're sitting tonight. I love those kind of connections. Doc Holliday's uncle. And finally, the last one that does not involve famous Hollywood personalities or gunfighters. One of the great photographs in our National Park Service files, I've known about it ever since I've been here, It's a photograph, a series of photographs taken in 1937, June of 1937. So it's the 75th anniversary almost of these 7 days battles, just about 75 years and 1 month ago. And it shows a group of Army officers sitting under the trees in front of the West House. It's the same trees that you all stood under in the 532, or those of you who were there. It's precisely the same trees. They were already planted in 1937. And I always thought it was interesting that Army officers would come and study our 7 days battlefields. It was before that even belonged to the National Park. But when I started looking at it a little bit better, looking at the caption, turns out it was the Army War College class coming down from Carlisle Barracks. And so last week I finally dawned on me that I ought to see who was in the Army War College class of 1937. The photographs show about 40 officers sitting on camp stools with big maps rolled out on their laps, studying Malvern Hill in 1937. 3 of the men who were in that Army War College class, and presumably in that photograph, were Matt Ridgway, who commanded the 82nd Airborne in World War II, and Walter Beadle Smith, who was Dwight Eisenhower's Chief of Staff for 4 years during World War II, and Mark Clark, who commanded the United States 5th Army. Precisely 7 Junes later in Italy, Mark Clark recaptured Rome from the Germans. And I often like to think, before I even knew who those guys were, I knew they had to be good, well-known officers of some sort. I often like to think about whether they ever thought about what they learned at Malvern Hill or any other Civil War battlefields. Did their staff rides, their terrain studies, the lessons they learned from what happened here, did any of that influence them in Italy or Germany, or as they managed armies like Walter Beadle Smith, or as Matt Ridgway dropped his paratroopers into France? I don't know, but I'd like to think that it had some influence on them, and that's a good specific Malvern Hill connection. These things exist at every battlefield: Cross Keys, Chancellorsville, Winchester, the Wilderness, whatever. You can find examples like this if you dig. But of course, today's not their anniversary, it's ours. And so we'll talk about the good Malvern Hill connections for a moment longer. When the Union Army retreated on the night of July the 1st, it started to rain. Superintendent mentioned the weather, very moderate in the low 80s. A front blew in that night, and the nearest weather station reported that on July the 2nd, the day after this battle, there were 1.6 inches of rain over the course of the day. Now that was in Washington, D.C., but even so, those of you who are Virginians, you know we get big thunderstorms, but we don't get rain showers in July that last a whole day and pour 1.5 inches of rain on the battlefields, and that really embarrassed McClellan's retreat toward Harrison's Landing. He left a small rear guard behind, and as they looked out on the morning of July the 2nd through the drizzle and through the fog and the mist that was rising from the battlefield, 2 of them wrote what they saw in famous accounts, one of them very often used, W.W. Averill, looking from the crest of the hill toward the Confederate approach route. He says that the bodies were laying everywhere. They were in every attitude of distress, curled up or sprawled singly and in heaps and rows, 1/3 of them dead or dying, but enough living and moving to give the field a gruesome, crawling appearance. And a New York artillerist who was also on rearguard duty said it was the sad privilege of some of us to remain on the field until the morning of July the 2nd, and such sights as met our vision in the light of day cannot be described. The dead and wounded lay in piles promiscuously as they had fallen, and that battlefield of Malvern Hill, as we saw it, can never be forgotten. And so we come finally to the end of this week of historical commemorations. The clock strikes 1:50 for us for the last time on the 7 days battles tonight. And we can look out across this nearly pristine field, as you all have been doing while I've talked, and you can be glad that it survives today. Much of it preserved thanks to the good work of the Civil War Preservation Trust, and now slated to be managed forever by dedicated historians working for the National Park Service. There's been some talk about celebration. Heard some people say kind of sanctimoniously, well, you can't celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. There's too much carnage, there's too much bloodshed. It would be inappropriate to use the word celebrate. And of course that's true. Nobody expects to celebrate widespread carnage and suffering. But at the same time, we absolutely should celebrate the opportunity we have tonight and for the rest of the remaining 3 years to stand on some of the most historic ground in America, now preserved forever. Battlefields are about real people doing real things life-changing things, sometimes nation-changing things. Please appreciate your time here at this historic site. Thank you for being here on the anniversary. Happy anniversary to all of you.
If you could persevere with us for just one moment, in the twilight of every anniversary event during the season of our sesquicentennial commemoration, we will play taps. Familiar to every ear and moving to every heart, the melody has special connections to our local battlefields. In July 1862, just days after the conclusion of the devastating 7 days battles, Union General Daniel Butterfield rearranged an existing bugle call into what we know as taps. Just 24 haunting notes, they convey thousands of words of meaning. Tonight, we will play taps over the battlefield, an eloquent and timeless salute to all the soldiers and sailors who fought and died for our nation. If you can stand, please join me. Thank you.